Mr. President, distinguished delegates, observers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Human Rights Council today on behalf of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran, together with my fellow members, Professor Shaheen Sardar Ali from Pakistan and Viviana Krsticevic from Argentina. In November 2022, the Council established this mission to investigate the alleged human rights violations in Iran in connection with the protests that began there on 16 September 2022, especially with respect to women and children. During our oral update last July, we made clear to the Council that we would go wherever the evidence led us. In that spirit, we've carried out...
Could we please have full silence in the room so that we can follow the presentation of the report and our work in the required conditions? I thank you.
Thank you. As I said, during our oral update last July, we made clear to the Council that we would go wherever the evidence led us. In that spirit, we've carried out a thorough and independent investigation over the past year into the alleged violations and the surrounding facts and circumstances. From the outset, we sought in good faith Apologies. Regrettably, the government did not grant the mission access to the country, nor respond to our calls for meetings, nor send us any information in response to the 21 detailed letters of inquiry that we sent up to January 24. At the same time, the government's continued and extensive restrictions on online communications in the country, including surveillance, harassment, and intimidation of victims and their families, inhibited many people who might otherwise have come forward from doing so for fear of reprisals. The mission also took an approach of extreme caution, following the do no harm principle. Despite these challenges, the mission ultimately collected and preserved over 27,000 evidence items. It conducted a total of 134 in-depth interviews with victims and witnesses, including 49 women and 85 men, both inside and outside the country, and gathered evidence and analysis from experts on digital and medical forensics, ballistics, sexual and gender-based violence, and domestic and international law, amongst others. The mission also very closely reviewed the government of Iran's own official documents, including public statements of officials, alongside 39 out of 41 reports of Iran's High Council for Human Rights. And we also held exchanges with the President-mandated special committee to investigate the 22 unrests. We believe the mission's findings therefore stand on a methodologically sound foundation, and they support the conclusions in our report and also the conference room paper which we'll be releasing today. Mr. President, today as we speak, we're very conscious that gross human rights violations and international crimes, including in the context of armed conflicts, are raging across the world. And double standards prevail. It's important that the Human Rights Council and the international community respond to the violations that are occurring across the globe, and the most serious of them. But Mr. President, we believe that double standards also obtain when countries perpetrate violations against their own nationals and people inside their own territories, while speaking of international justice abroad. It's important to remember that when the Council mandates an investigation, it must carry through and follow through on what the findings are. And therefore, Mr. President, we ask you to look into what our findings are here today. Mr. President, as you'll be aware, one of the first issues that we had to look into, and as the Council will be aware, was the death in custody of Jina Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman. She was arrested by the morality police for an alleged violation of the rules on mandatory hijab. Within 3 days of her arrest, she was dead in custody, after having been taken for re-education and then into a hospital. Our findings showed, based on examination of medical documents and also of pattern evidence of the treatment of women in these situations, that Jina Mahsa Amini's death was an unlawful death, and we believe that the state is responsible. Our findings also included the response to the protests that broke out after Jina Mahsa's death. Following her death, protests sparked right across the country, from Tehran to different regions, and grew into what we now know as the Women, Life and Freedom movement. Young women and school children were at the forefront, with many removing their mandatory hijab in public places as an act of defiance against long-standing discriminatory laws and practices. Men and boys joined in solidarity, along with people from diverse backgrounds, including minorities, articulating long-standing grievances and demanding equality, justice, and social and political reforms. In response, the entire state apparatus mobilized to suppress their mounting demands for basic human rights. During the protests, the security forces used firearms, including assault rifles, AK-47s, metal pellets, and paintball guns, causing deaths and extensive injuries. The use of such unnecessary and disproportionate force on largely peaceful protests resulted in unlawful killings and injuries of protesters, and we found credible figures of 551 deaths, amongst them at least 49 women and 68 children, in 26 out of the 31 provinces in Iran. There were disproportionately high numbers in minority-populated regions. On just one day, 30th September 22, Bloody Friday as it came to be called, in Zahedan city in Sistan and Baluchistan province, credible information indicates that security forces killed 103 protesters and bystanders, mostly men and boys, the highest number of deaths documented within a single day during the entire protests. The mission acknowledges the government's claim that some 54 members of the security forces were also killed and many others injured. The mission requested information from the government of Iran about the circumstances of those deaths in order to investigate them further. We asked for this information last June, but we've received no further response till today to enable us to assess those claims in accordance with our methodology. Mr. President, as you may have all seen, widespread images of protesters wearing a white protective patch over one or both of their eyes became a hallmark of the 22 protests and afterwards. This didn't happen by chance. The mission found a pattern of security forces targeting their firearms towards vital body parts of protesters and bystanders, including the face, head, neck, torso, and genital area. Victims with multiple pellets in their bodies remained without access to medical care, sometimes for months after the injury, with some continuing to receive threats when they spoke up about their injuries. A woman protester who was blinded in one eye was told by security forces that they would, quote, hunt her down and come for her other eye, unquote. Mr. President, security forces also carried out mass arbitrary arrests of protesters. The government of Iran itself announced that 22,000 people were pardoned in connection with the protests, suggesting that many more were detained or charged. Women and men, boys and girls, were viciously beaten and arrested while dancing, chanting, writing slogans, or simply honking car horns in peaceful acts of solidarity. Upon apprehension, security forces transferred detainees en masse in a coordinated manner to unofficial detention facilities run by the Ministry of Intelligence, the Basij, and the Revolutionary Guards. As we heard from witnesses, while in detention, many protesters, including women and children, were held incommunicado in inhumane conditions, subjected in some cases to prolonged solitary confinement, which stripped basic facets of their dignity. Security forces deprived them from contacting their families or lawyers and put them out of reach of the law, in some cases in conditions amounting to enforced disappearances. To punish, humiliate, or extract a confession from them, detainees were subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, and we found cases of gang rape, rape with an object, beatings, floggings, and electric shocks in acts that clearly constituted torture. Security forces, we found, sought to punish women in particular for their participation in the Women, Life, Freedom movement, justifying the use of sexual violence on the basis that this was, quote, the freedom they wanted. Children were also subjected to extrajudicial killings, torture, and rape, and held in detention along with adults. Others were brought to juvenile detention centers or mental health facilities aimed at reforming them. Trials were marred by systematic violations of due process. Most persons tried in connection with the protests were brought before revolutionary courts on vague charges of, quote, corruption on earth, unquote, or, quote, waging war against God, unquote, in relation to protected conduct or speech. Many were denied access to counsel of their choice and not able to access their case files or copies of their judgments. Judges manifested clear bias against protesters, systematically dismissing complaints of rape, torture, and ill treatment. And at least 9 young men were arbitrarily executed following hasty and flawed proceedings that disregarded basic fair trial and due process guarantees, creating terror amongst the protesters. By January this year, Iranian courts had pronounced at least 26 death sentences against persons in relation to the protests. Mr. President, a year and a half since the protests began, the government of Iran has yet to acknowledge or recognize the grievances that brought protesters to the street. Not only does accountability remain elusive for people, but the government takes concerted measures to silence victims and their families seeking truth and justice. It has also targeted those supporting them, including journalists and lawyers who've been arrested. Lawyers have been suspended from the bar, harassed by the authorities, and prevented from representing protesters. Authorities have taken concerted action to conceal the truth about killings and attempt to silence the grieving families of killed protesters. They've also systematically threatened and intimidated, assaulted or arrested family members simply for mourning their loved ones and for speaking out to demand justice. One relative of a protester who had been killed told us, "We're not even allowed to mourn, which compounds our anguish. Not a single person has been arrested in connection with the killing over the past year, yet within the same period, several members of my family have been arrested." A year and a half on, women and girls are still confronted daily by discrimination in law and practice, affecting virtually all aspects of their public and private lives. We're receiving chilling reports on the use by the state of artificial intelligence, including through new mobile apps, to monitor and enforce compliance by women and girls with mandatory hijab rules. It's hard to fathom that in the 21st century, women's access to the most basic services and opportunities and public spaces, such as schools, universities, hospitals, and courts, or to opportunities for jobs in government or in the private sector, should be subjected to a wholly arbitrary requirement to whether or not they wear the mandatory hijab. Whether a woman or girl chooses to wear hijab or not cannot determine her access to fundamental rights and freedoms. Mr. President, let me conclude. The primary responsibility and duty to protect and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms lies with the state. In our case, we have found, through our investigations, we have found the violations that have occurred, the human rights violations, include violations of the right to life, the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment, the right to protection against arbitrary detention and imprisonment, and protection against rape and sexual and gender-based violence. We have also found that in the context of widespread and systematic attacks against the civilian population, some of these amount also to crimes against humanity, particularly murder, rape, and torture, and also to gender persecution, intersecting with ethnic and religious grounds. In the context of Iran, we have found that historic and systemic impunity has robbed the society of hopes for justice and redress in relation to these violations and crimes. Witnesses have consistently asked us what the outcome of a complaint might be, noting that it would be the protesters themselves who would ultimately be prosecuted if they were to seek justice. The courage of the victims, witnesses, and their family members, and all those who have stood in solidarity with them, who have entrusted to us their stories, underscores the need for the international community to demonstrate their solidarity in turn, and to match this with concrete measures for support to victims, including by exploring avenues of justice, wherever they may be. Without holding accountable the perpetrators of the violations in the context of the protests that started in 2022, the cycle of impunity cannot be broken. We therefore urge the government of Iran to take immediate and concrete measures to halt executions, promptly release all those arbitrarily detained in connection with the protests, including women who have been arrested for defying the mandatory hijab rules, to cease judicial harassment of victims and their families, and provide them with redress, truth, justice, and reparations, and to dismantle and disband the persecutory system of the enforcement of these laws and policies. I thank you for your attention.